We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future. You are interested in the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here. And now, for the first time, we are bringing to you the full story of what happened on that fateful day.
Have any of you ever heard of a movie called Plan 9 from Outer Space?
No.
Nope.
No.
Not at all.
Never. What's it about?
It is about the resurrection of the dead.
Not my type of movie.
Nah.
Sorry.
Would you agree to be interviewed about Plan 9 from Outer Space? Have you ever heard of a film called Plan 9 from Outer Space?
No, I never heard because I never go to the movies.
We were having a video party. A couple friends of mine were UCLA students, and there was starting to be a buzz about this movie that was the worst movie ever made.
Suppose that saucer or whatever it was had something to do with this?
Your guess is as good as mine, Larry. One thing sure, Inspector Clay's dead. Murdered. And somebody's responsible.
We're on the streets of fabulous Hollywood with John, the district manager of Pacific Theaters, and he has seen
Plan 9 from Outer Space, with the main character being a gorilla suit with a scuba diving helmet on.
John, I think you've got that mixed up with Robot Monster.
Oh, Robot Monster, right.
In addition to the reputation that Plan 9 has as being just sort of a crazy, nutty, bad movie, there are some legitimately effective shots in the picture. That famous bit where a vampire is coming at you with her hands, you know, I mean, that actually was a very haunting shot.
Ed Wood makes films like, or made films like no other.
Ed Wood.
Because Ed Wood was, bless his heart, an auteur. And if there ever was one, you'll never mistake a bad movie made by anybody else for one made by Ed Wood.
I never felt that Plan 9 was the worst movie ever made. I think that either The Creeping Terror or Gone with the Wind.
One night, and this isn't a sexual thing, I was lying in bed and Ed came, I felt his spirit, into my room, and he began to dance for me. But he didn't dance with the dress on. He danced as a satyr. And it appeared to me that his feet became these little hooves. And he was Ed Wood, all with the satyr, below the belt, and above he was like a beautiful Apollo.
People turning south from the freeway were startled when they saw 3 flying saucers high over Hollywood Boulevard. My friend, can your heart stand the shocking facts about Plan 9? Punish the guilty.
Your stupid minds! Stupid! Stupid!
Reward the innocent.
I'm a big boy now, Johnny.
Can you prove that it didn't happen?
Eddie Wood's in outer space. Art or mistake. Plan 9 decide.
Oh yes, Plan 9 deals with
Saucers seen over Hollywood.
the dead, brought to a simulated life by our electrode guns.
Flying saucers seen over Washington, D.C.
You mean the kind from up there?
Inspector Clay, hero. Down the dead old man.
Tragic.
His dead wife.
Big Army brand.
Now its counterpart.
The Solomonites.
Solarite. The Solarite.
The Solarite.
I'm standing under the marquee of the landmark Vista Theater in Hollywood. It was on this block that D.W. Griffith filmed Intolerance. And it was just around the corner here, at the only place in Los Angeles where Hollywood and Sunset Boulevards intersect, that a young would-be filmmaker named Edward D. Wood, Jr. began renting an office apartment. The year was 1947. Wood had just formed a production company with a partner to produce commercials for early television.
Wood Thomas Productions. It was listed in the Studio Blue Book at that time.
4477 Hollywood Boulevard is still rental office space today with lawyers and accountants, its main tenants. But in 1947, these were the secondary offices of the feisty independent Monogram Pictures.
We leased out a couple of offices, one across the way from the other. And we took those offices to set up our production company. That's how we began it.
Now, when Ed lived and worked here, he had yet to write or direct any of the films for which he would eventually earn his bizarre and extraordinary reputation. And he was almost a decade away from creating his magnum opus, the film which will always be associated with his name, and the one that we're here to document and to celebrate, Plan 9 from Outer Space.
They come from the bowels of hell, a transformed race of walking dead. Zombies guided by a master plan for complete domination of the Earth. Plan 9 from Outer Space.
It's been called a sci-fi exploitation masterpiece, a triumph of will over talent, the greatest of unintentional comedies, and by some, the worst film of all time. Call it what you will, Plan 9 from Outer Space is a bona fide cult phenomenon. In fact, it's the king of the cult movies. And today, some 36 years after it was made, its notoriety continues to grow.
This is the most fantastic story I've ever heard. And every word of it's true, too. That's the fantastic part of it.
Ed Wood was a charming guy. He had the flamboyancy, wore the mustache, and he looked a little bit like Earl Flynn.
Plan 9's creator was a high-spirited, surprisingly charming, ambitious, complex, and unusual man. Almost immediately upon his arrival in Hollywood at the age of 24, he would begin attracting to himself what one critic has uncharitably described as an entourage of Day of the Locust weirdos, to whom Wood tried to play benign Svengali. He promised these fellow showfolk work in his films, if he ever got to make any.
I said, Ed, look, I'm no actor. I have no intentions of ever appearing in films. I have no training as an actor. Don't worry about it, he says. You're in my pictures.
We were Hollywood bottom fish, I guess. You know, a bizarre Hollywood losers, and that's what was available to him.
Eventually, Wood's stock company would grow to include its most famous members, the great but by then fading horror star Bela Lugosi, the flamboyant newspaper and television psychic Criswell, TV horror hostess Vampira, and the 400-pound wrestler-turned-actor Tor Johnson. More about them later. Over a 32-year career until his death in 1978, Ed Wood struggled to finance and wrote, produced, and directed 7 films and scripted at least 5 films for other low-budget directors. A lightning-fast typist, he also sold reams of short fiction to lurid magazines and wrote scores of steamy and violent exploitation paperbacks, when his sporadic opportunities as a director began to decline. In the 70s, he would even write and direct sex education, softcore, and even a number of hardcore pornographic films to keep bread on the table.
A friend of mine from New York, a publisher, he had some of the girly magazines. He needed somebody to write a couple of stories. So I said, listen, I have a good writer, a good friend of mine. So I introduced Alan Stern to Eddie Wood.
He would only give those books to his close friends. He'd autograph them. To him, it was just
a crutch to pay bills until he could do another mainstream movie.
I think that it really broke him. The fact that he ended up directing Super 8 movies for some porno series called The Encyclopedia of Sex. You know, and this is not a job for a guy who made such classics as Plan 9 and Bride of the Monster and Glen or Glenda.
At the time they were made, Wood's films were given the most limited of theatrical release.
To kind of give you an idea where his films were, think of let's say a Russ Meyer film. An Ed Wood film would be about 10 rungs down the ladder from his.
Nevertheless, the best of Wood's output, though made for next to nothing, technically imperfect, and unconventionally directed, to put it mildly, exerts a unique and feverish pull on the viewer. Ed Wood hurled his artistic heart and soul into his movies, and he did it with a solemn conviction that was almost frightening.
He aimed so high, and I think that's what makes these films almost comic, is that they try so hard. The actors try so hard. And he as a director and as a writer tries so hard to make some kind of statement about that's going to move you.
You know, it's an interesting thing when you consider the Earth people who can think are so frightened by those who cannot, the dead.
The fact that he made these pictures against all odds, including his own total lack of talent as a filmmaker, I think is what speaks the best about him. I mean, he really wanted to do this. And he did it. And the big difference between Ed Wood and his detractors like the Medveds and other people, the people who really put him down and say he was not just a bad filmmaker, but a worthless filmmaker, which are two different things, is that he actually made these movies, by God.
Plan 9 or any of his pictures are truly an extension of where he was coming from, which is, I suppose, a definition of what a pure filmmaker is supposed to be about. Why they continue to fascinate us is the fact that they were so inept, so perfectly inept that they wind up being legitimately good in a completely reverse sort of way.
Ed Wood's life and career were filled with alternating bursts of creative expression and longer periods of personal and professional frustration. He loved movies, and he wanted to make them, but lacking any real experience, he was unable to find work within the studio system. And this forced him time and again to find backing from money men in other professions.
A filmmaker like Ed Wood, who, best word would be to use unique to describe what he did, probably has a window of time where what he or she does, they can get away with it. And they're the ones that are most likely to hire or employ themselves. And so it could be tough to have a vision as unique as what Plan 9 and Glen or Glenda and Bride of the Monster and all those movies, to have that unique vision and then have somebody else hire you.
Ed was always being approached by distributors for many of his projects, but he didn't want to tie in first, because, you know, the thrill of producing is having a sleeper on your hands. And if you tie it up with a pre-release, then you're limited to a budget. The distributor or releasing company will generally have one of their production men there writing herd every minute. And when it's all over with, they wind up owning it all, you know. So your end is very small for all your efforts. So he preferred to take the gamble, the risk, do it as cheaply as possible, and then, you know, try for the best distribution you can get.
Though Wood enjoyed the creative freedom that came with independent financing, the strain of sustaining his career in this way would eventually take its toll.
There's a saying that every artist in the world is going to have his heart broken by the world. That was certainly the case with Ed.
He would hit the jug, the sauce. It was toward the end where he just gave up completely. And it wasn't a fact of feeling sorry for himself. It was a fact that he said to himself, I failed.
I understand that he was he was an alcoholic, but a periodic drinker. And people who, like me, who didn't know him well, would see him only when he was on the manic side of his persona. And we saw him always extremely ebullient.
Well, he said, Paul, he says, I'm doing my best. Look at me, he says. I could have been a millionaire. I should have $1 million in the bank right now. And he started crying.
That was a time that he seemed to be in a period of depression or lethargy and melancholy, and he would call The minister that played the minister in the film, I think his name was Lemon, I believe. I was told that sometime late at night, he would call him and they would talk.
Wood was also a cross-dresser, a fact known to just a few friends at first. It was a condition that he would explore in his very first feature film, I Changed My Sex, better known as Glenn or Glenda. Wood acts in the film as well, playing Glenn, who struggles with his compulsion for wearing women's clothing. The rumors that Wood directed in drag throughout his career can be traced to the making of this film, in which he had to direct a number of scenes while appearing in them as well, clothed in skirt, blouse, and heels to portray Glenn's alter ego, Glenda.
Glenn or Glenda, this is his plea for the world to understand transvestism and to understand why he is so attracted to Angora.
He had a fetish for Angora sweaters one day, and he was telling me how much he liked Angora sweaters, and it went on, and I nodded my head, you know, and I listened to it. It reminded me of Queeg and the Caine Mutiny with the steel balls.
It would seem to me that the mother wanted the daughter. But evidently, they did dress him up in little girl's clothes, and his comment to people was, well, you know, they didn't know what the hell they were doing to me.
Bill Thompson arranged a meeting between me and Eddie. I don't know who called who, I think Eddie called me. And I said, okay, I'll meet you at the Brown Derby on Las Feliz. And because we never met each other, I told him I'll meet you at the bar, ask the maitre d', and he'll tell you who I am. So I went a little bit early, I'm sitting at the bar having a drink, and I told the maitre d', I'm expecting a gentleman, he's going to ask him. After a little while, the maitre d', whom I knew quite well, he came and said, Mr. Apostolov, he never called me Mr. Apostolov, Mr. Apostolov, your date is here. What are you talking about? And I turned, and my God, here is Eddie. I have never seen Eddie before in my life, but the first impression was I thought he was going to die. Eddie was wearing, I'll never forget it, white sweater, Angora sweater, mini skirts, because that was in the 60s. A red miniskirt, white boots, high heels, a funny baloney tits here, and a 3-day beard he didn't shave, and a mustache, and a very masculine voice. Hello, how are you? Good to meet you. It was funny.
Ed Wood was born in this house in Poughkeepsie, New York on October 10th, 1924.
Ed Wood Sr. was a postal inspector, or postal clerk, and Lillian was a jewelry buyer. And if they didn't know where he was, they did know where he was. He was at the movies, because he had gotten a job as a usher at the Bardavon Theater. He became a fan of the serials, like Flash Gordon, Buck Jones. Buck Jones was his childhood hero, and Chandu the Magician. He was definitely impressed and saw Dracula when it played in Poughkeepsie in 1931. So he was about 6 or 7 years old at that time. And seeing Dracula was, I guess, like a very dramatic turning point for Ed. And he never forgot that.
His mother was a doll collector. She was a fragile, bird-like woman who collected little miniature porcelain dolls. She kept them in glass showcases, lighted, and you know, they were adorable little figures. And she raised her pretty little baby boy, rather, I think, as though he were a little porcelain doll. So his escape was the movies on Saturday afternoons, and I think that became his real world. You know, that could be why he went into films.
Rudolph Gray, author of the recent book Nightmare of Ecstasy, The Life and Art of Edward D. Wood, Jr., has spent the last 10 years researching Wood's life. He notes that while Wood's parents may have been overly protective of their only child, They happily encouraged his fascination with the movies.
I would say Ed Wood's parents did encourage his creative side, because when he was 11 years old, they did get him a movie camera, which is something I'm sure he wanted for a long time.
Author Gray feels strongly that there is a need to document the lives of filmmakers like Wood.
This Twilight area of film, if you want to call it that, really needs to be documented. Directors like Ed Wood, I mean, no one has really documented their struggle or their life.
Ed Wood's first job in Hollywood was as an actor, performing various roles at a local playhouse called the Gateway Theater. It was here that Ed Wood met John Crawford Thomas, a fellow actor who would prove to be Ed's first financier. Crawford and Ed originally teamed up to produce commercials, but eager to make movies, Ed suggested they make a Western featurette instead.
We wanted to produce this movie, and the next day he comes up with a script, and I didn't even know he could write.
Even at this early stage, as a director, Ed's strength seemed to lay less in meticulous preparation than in applying an instant ingenuity.
In the case of Coffin for the Crossroads of Laredo, I said, "Where's a coffin? Where are you going to get a coffin?" And they came within minutes. They came up with a cardboard coffin, and it didn't look like much of a coffin, but he got it together.
Wood himself appears in one of Crossroads of Laredo's early scenes.
He was a traveler. It was Don Nagel who was the villain and shot Ed Wood on the trail.
Crossroads of Laredo was never completed. Crawford Thomas was forced to pull the plug on the production when it went dangerously over budget. It was the end of his and Ed Wood's short-lived partnership.
More money was being requested, to the best of my knowledge, for additional expenses. And then I believe we're dovetailing into, Ed's end of it, where, I would have to be supporting him too.
Crawford Thomas still owns the negative to Crossroads of Laredo and hopes to release it to Ed Wood fans in the future. The following year, Ed is asked to be cameraman on a short film Conrad Brooks and his brother Henry want to make as a showcase for their acting talents. Shooting takes place at a since built-over ranch near the Mulholland Fountain in the Los Feliz area of L.A. In his zeal, Wood winds up taking over the set, directing as well as shooting. Examination of this footage resulted in a unique discovery. A second camera on the set that day in 1948 had managed to capture the only known film record of Ed Wood directing. Wood continued to knock around Hollywood for the next several years, struggling to get various projects going but accomplishing relatively little, until he meets an actor whose impact upon him as a child he has never forgotten, an actor who will dramatically affect the course of Ed's young career, Bela Lugosi.
I was a real Bela Lugosi fan. I love everything he's done, man. He's one of the most curious figures there is in horror.
For more than 2 decades, Lugosi had been an international horror star, appearing in such films as The Black Cat, The Raven, White Zombie, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Son of Frankenstein.
Father was Frankenstein, that your mother was the lightning.
Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and the role he was never to escape, Dracula.
Doesn't Dracula ever end for you?
No. Dracula never ends. I don't know whether I shall call it a fortune or a course, but it never ends.
But it did end. By the early 50s, Lugosi found himself virtually unemployable in Hollywood, a victim of typecasting and changing times. Even Universal Pictures, when casting Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, almost overlooked Bela to reprise the role of the vampire count.
This is awful silly stuff.
I think it was Paul Marco, who was working over at Universal on a film, and he heard they were doing this, and they'd auditioned 3 other people for Dracula or something, and they hadn't even called Lugosi. And he offered Lugosi's name, and they said, well, we didn't think he was still alive.
At the age of 70, Lugosi is reduced to making promotional appearances for films he has nothing to do with, such as the 1953 Vincent Price film House of Wax. Touched by Lugosi's plight, Ed Wood befriends Bela, and the two become quite close. Ed arranges a successful Las Vegas horror review for Lugosi, and before long has Bela anticipating a comeback. Wood began planning a series of films to star the forgotten king of horror.
Pull the string. Dance to that. Which one is created for?
In Glen or Glenda, Wood made bizarre use of Lugosi as an omnipotent puppet master of mankind. Makeup artist Harry Thomas.
Lugosi was respected. And of all people, I respected him. And I believe I might have mentioned it to you sometime when I was cutting his hair, that he gave me this big black cigar, and not to offend him, he lit it and put it in my mouth, and I was high. And being as young as I was at that time, I felt this dizziness, this vertigo. And every time the cigar would go out, I'd be happy. But he'd see it and relight it, which was the worst thing that could happen to me.
The standard view of Ed and Bela's relationship has been that Wood exploited Lugosi as a box office shill to further his own career. But the truth was more complicated.
I have a feeling that Lugosi became to Ed Wood sort of as Renfield to Dracula, that Ed Wood felt that he had a falling star here, that perhaps he could help rise once again, and genuinely cared about him.
They were both kind of hoyden and cut-ups. You know, you wouldn't think Bela Lugosi was, but he was Scorpio. And they would go to the cemetery, literally, the true cemetery. And Bela would put on a black cape. And Ed always had this whimsy, pixie, craziness with intelligence all combined, which makes genius, they say. But he would run through the cemetery and Bela would be after him, and they would just have a ball.
I was able to see something about how he treated, how Ed treated Bela and what the relationship was. And I now reason that initially it was probably a business relationship. Ed was able to get a hold of a star name for peanuts, right? A has-been who was working for nothing practically, and that's all Ed could afford. And so he was grateful to have it, but it grew into a really beautiful friendship. Ed was there for him because Ed was a sweet, tender heart, and this man was sick and dying, and he was old and friendless and poor and needed medicine, and Ed was there for him.
Lugosi next starred for Wood in Bride of the Monster. During production, it was apparent Lugosi's health was failing, and the proud actor's decade-long medically incurred addiction to morphine was no secret to the cast and crew. Paul Marco played Kelton the cop for Wood in 3 films. He recalls having to break shooting in the middle of the night in Griffith Park to drive Lugosi home for an injection of what Lugosi called his medicine.
First thing that caught my eye was this huge picture of him with his cape on, very sturdy, and looked like Count Dracula. So I'm sitting there like this, and he goes to these drapes, and he pulls open the drapes, and I'm all agog trying to see everything, and he goes to sink, washes his hands real good, takes a little towel, and wipes it. Then he has one of these sternal heaters, sort of, and took out a sterile needle and went through all this religious thing. And I'm watching him. And then he gave him the injection, and he went right back doing the same thing. Taking his apron off, hanging it on the hook, washing his hands, right all over again. And everything was perfect in there. And closed the curtain, and I'm sitting right there.